Have you ever realized that you could go an entire day without once noticing your own breath? You rush to check your phone, reply to emails, scroll past 1,000 images, answer questions, nod through conversations, stand in lines, sit in traffic. But breathe, not really. You inhale the deadlines, you exhale anxiety, you hold your breath during tough meetings, you lose your breath in the crowd. And somewhere along the way, you forgot the simplest truth of all: life is breath. Try this with me just for a moment. Close your eyes if you can. Take a slow, deep breath in and let it all go. Did you feel that? That little pause between breaths, that's where peace lives. Yet we spend most of our lives anywhere but there, chasing tomorrow, regretting yesterday, living half awake in a world that never stops moving. We breathe just enough to survive, but not enough to truly live. The Buddha once said, "Mindfulness of breathing is the path to the deathless." A bold statement, but he wasn't speaking in riddles. He meant it quite literally. Because the breath is not just oxygen, it's presence, it's awareness. It's your body's way of whispering, "I'm still here." Even when your mind is lost 1,000 miles away. Look around. The modern world is speeding up. And the faster it moves, the more disconnected we become from our own bodies, our emotions, our inner silence. We wear productivity like armor. We confuse burnout for bravery. We think rest is laziness, and stillness is weakness. But the truth is, the real strength begins when you pause, when you choose to stop, even for a moment, and breathe fully, with intention. That simple act can change everything. Think about it. When you were born, what was the very first thing you did? You took a breath. The room held its breath with you, and in that moment, life began, not with a name, not with a thought, but with breath. So when did we stop honoring it? Breath has no religion. It doesn't ask you to believe in anything. It simply is. It's the one thing you carry from the moment you arrive until the moment you leave. Yet we treat it like background noise, never realizing it's been quietly guiding us through every storm, every joy, every heartbreak. When anxiety floods in, the breath tightens. When anger rises, the breath sharpens. When love touches you, the breath softens. It's always there, speaking the language of the soul, long before the mind even begins to understand. But here's the tragedy. We're living in an age of shallow breathing. Scroll, stress, scroll again, check one more thing, do one more task, then wonder why we feel empty, disconnected, on edge. It's not just because of what we do. It's how we breathe while doing it. Our breath mirrors our lives. Shallow breath, shallow presence. Rushed breath, rushed choices. No breath, no awareness. So ask yourself, when did you stop breathing deeply? Was it when life got busy? When heartbreak knocked at your door? When the world told you that slowing down was falling behind? Whatever the reason, you can come back. You can return to the rhythm that's always been within you. There is a sacred wisdom in the breath. It doesn't scream. It doesn't beg for attention. It simply waits, patiently, compassionately, for you to remember. And when you do, even just one conscious breath can bring you back home, not to a place, not to an idea, but to yourself. So today we begin again with something so small. It's often overlooked, and yet so powerful. It has shaped every moment of your life. The breath. We will explore it, feel it, understand it, not just as a biological function, but as a spiritual doorway, a timeless practice, a path walked by sages and scientists alike, a key that unlocks not just the present moment, but the very essence of being Ao. It begins with a gasp, a sudden trembling inhale, a cry that pierces the silence. The lungs, untouched until this moment, expand for the very first time. And life rushes in like a flood. No words, no thoughts, no story yet. Just one sacred moment, the first breath. That breath is more than biology. It's a declaration, a soul entering this world not through language or identity, but through presence. That cry isn't just noise. It's awakening. It's the body's way of saying, I am here. And everyone in the room, they hold their breath too, waiting, hoping, praying for that tiny inhale. Because in that moment, breath is life. So why do we forget that? How do we go from honoring the breath like it's sacred to treating it like it's insignificant? When we were infants, breathing was instinctive, deep, full, rhythmic, no distractions, no tension, just aliveness flowing in and out. But as we grow, the world starts to tighten its grip. We learn to hold in pain, to hide tears, to armor our hearts, and slowly our breath shortens, not just in our lungs, but in our lives. In Buddhist teaching, this first breath is not random. It marks the entry point of dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness of conditioned existence. From that very inhale, we step into a world of impermanence. We become subject to aging, pain, change, and loss. And yet, that same breath is also the beginning of liberation, because the breath, when understood deeply, becomes the path back out of suffering. The Buddha didn't begin his teaching with abstract philosophy. He began with experience, and the breath is the most direct experience there is. It's not a belief, it's not a ritual, it's not bound to language or culture. You feel it right now. This moment, inhale, exhale. That's it, that's meditation. There's a story often told in monasteries. A disciple once asked the master, "Teacher, what is the most important thing in this life?" The master replied, "Your next breath, because without it, nothing else matters." That's not poetry, that's reality. You could go days without food, hours without water, but only minutes without breath. Yet we don't revere it, we rarely even notice it, until it's taken away. Consider this, the breath doesn't just keep you alive, it keeps you anchored. In Zen, they say, when you follow the breath, you follow the now. Every inhale is an arrival, every exhale is a letting go. A microcosm of birth and death, happening dozens of times per minute, right under your nose, quite literally. So what does life teach us with that first breath? It teaches that life is given, not earned. That presence is inborn, not manufactured. That our deepest truths are felt, not spoken. And most of all, that everything you need to wake up is already within you. No need for complicated mantras. No need for spiritual costumes. Just this, breathe in, breathe out, and stay. In the West, we often ask children, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" But in the East, especially in Buddhist tradition, the deeper question is, can you be fully present to who you are right now? Because if you can breathe with awareness, you can feel your life again, you can soften into it, you can awaken through it. That's not philosophy, that's practice. So maybe it's not about becoming someone, maybe it's about returning to the place where it all began, that simple, sacred breath, the one you took the day you arrived, the one that said, "I am alive, I am here, I am home." And if you can return to that breath now, truly return, then even the chaos of the world can't pull you out of yourself, because you're already in yourself, rooted, present, alive. So take a moment, not to analyze, not to fix, but just to breathe. Feel it as if it were your first time again. Feel it. There's something about silence that makes us uneasy. We fidget, we reach for our phones, we fill the gaps with noise. Music, words, plans, opinions, anything. But stillness. But what if the stillness wasn't empty? What if it was full of clarity, full of truth? What if every moment you tried to escape from was the very moment you needed most? We live in a world of distraction. Notifications, deadlines, drama. Every second is pulling us in another direction. And in that storm of doing, we forget how to simply be. But the breath, The breath is different. It doesn't demand, it doesn't chase, it doesn't rush. It waits quietly, patiently, ready to bring you back, not to yesterday, not to tomorrow, but here, now, when your thoughts spiral, when emotions flare, when your world feels like it's slipping out of your hands. You don't need a grand escape. You don't need to fix everything. You just need an anchor, and the breath is that anchor. It holds you steady. While the waves crash, it reminds you gently but firmly that peace isn't in the future. It's not after the next achievement, or the next relationship, or the next meditation retreat. It's here, in this inhale, in this exhale, this one, in the teachings of the Buddha. There's a simple but powerful practice. Anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing. No chanting, no complicated postures, just the breath, observed with full awareness. Breathing in, I know that I am breathing in. Breathing out, I know that I am breathing out. That's it. But don't mistake simplicity for weakness. This one practice, done with sincerity, has led countless beings to awakening, not because it's fancy, but because it brings you face to face with what is real. Try it now. Inhale slowly, but don't force it. Just feel the air moving in. Feel your chest rise. Feel the moment stretch open like sunlight. Now exhale, let it go completely. No clinging, no resistance. That was presence, not manufactured, not imagined, not bought or borrowed, pure awareness, undistracted being. There's a quiet power in those few seconds. When you watch the breath without judgment, you begin to see more than just air moving. You see your mind, its patterns, its urges to escape, its cravings, its fears, but you also see something deeper, a space within you that's never in panic, never rushing, never needing to be anywhere but here. That space is always there. You've just forgotten how to enter it, and the key has always been your breath. There's a reason monks in remote caves and therapists in glass offices teach the same thing. Come back to your breath, not because it's trendy, but because it works. When anxiety strikes, anchor to the breath. When grief floods, anchor to the breath. When joy overwhelms, anchor to the breath, not to suppress, but to witness, to fully be with what is, because nothing is more honest than the breath. It can't lie to you. It doesn't perform, it simply reveals. This is your life right now. Are you here for it? Presence is not found in the absence of problems. It's found in the ability to stay with yourself as the problems pass through. And that ability, that unshakable inner stillness, isn't something you're born with or without. It's something you build. One breath at a time, you sit, you breathe, you return, not because it's easy, but because it's worth it. Because every time you return, you strengthen the muscle of awareness. You reclaim the moment, and in doing so, you reclaim yourself. People often ask, but how can I stay present when the world is so chaotic? The answer is simple, but not always easy. You train the mind where to rest, and the breath. It's always here, always safe, always true, no matter what happens around you. You always have tea. It's fascinating, isn't it, that what monks in saffron robes have been practicing in silence for centuries is now being studied with MRI machines, brain scans, and academic journals. What the Buddha taught under the Bodhi tree, modern science is only beginning to catch up with, and the bridge between the two, the breath. Think of it like this: when you sit in meditation, eyes closed, body still, and begin to follow your breath, you might feel calmer, more centered, more alive, but beneath the surface, your brain is undergoing something remarkable. You're not just relaxing, you're rewiring. Neuroscientists call it neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change itself, to form new pathways, to let go of old reactivity, and create space for wiser responses. And what sparks this change? Conscious awareness, sustained attention, mindful breathing. The same practice taught by the Buddha in the Anapanasati Sutta is now being shown to literally reshape the structure of the brain, not metaphorically, literally. Studies using functional MRI scans have found that even short-term mindfulness practice can reduce the activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear and stress center. That means less reactivity, less panic, less emotional hijacking. Meanwhile, areas like the prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making, focus, and compassion, become more active, more connected, more resilient. It's like upgrading the operating system of your mind. And the breath, it's not just the vehicle, it's the trigger. When you breathe slowly and deeply, especially through the nose, you activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the body's natural rest and digest mode. Heart rate slows, blood pressure drops, stress hormones decline, and perhaps most importantly, your body begins to trust that it's safe enough to open, to heal, to let go. But here's where it gets even more beautiful. When you breathe mindfully, you're not just calming the body, you're training awareness. You're learning to observe without judgment, to notice thoughts without being swallowed by them, to feel emotions without collapsing into them. And this ability, what scientists call meta-awareness, is one of the most significant predictors of long-term psychological well-being. In other words, learning to breathe with attention isn't just a spiritual practice, it's mental health, it's emotional intelligence, it's cognitive training. Now pause for a moment. Think of the implications. If the breath can calm the fear center of your brain, if it can strengthen your capacity for presence and clarity, if it can reshape how you respond to pain, grief, anger, anxiety, then breathing isn't just survival. It's mastery. A master musician doesn't just hear sound. They hear tone, texture, vibration. Likewise, a mindful human doesn't just breathe. They breathe with intention, with depth, with wisdom. And here's the poetic twist. The Buddha didn't have a brain scanner, no EEGs, no peer-reviewed journals, but through his own direct experience, through deep stillness and precise observation, he saw it all. He saw how the breath reflects the state of the mind, how controlling the breath could calm the mind, and how watching the breath without controlling it could liberate the mind. Modern science is only now discovering what the awakened mind knew all along. It's humbling, isn't it? That something so subtle, so quiet, so overlooked, holds within it the key to both ancient wisdom and modern healing. We tend to look for solutions in the complex, technology, pills, systems, but the most powerful medicine might just be the one thing you've had since birth, your breath. This is not to say science explains everything, but rather, it validates what many spiritual traditions have always known, that sometimes it comes out of nowhere, a word, a memory, a glance, and suddenly, your heart tightens, your chest burns, your mind spins like a storm caught in its own wind. You try to stay calm, but calm is gone, and in its place, anger, fear, grief, shame, waves rising faster than you can understand them. This is the inner storm, and if you're human, you've been there more than once, more than you'd admit. We live in a world that tells us to be strong, to stay in control, keep our face straight, bury the tremble behind the smile. But inside, something's shaking, and most of us have never been taught what to do when the storm hits, except maybe to run, distract, numb out, explode. But what if you didn't run this time? What if you didn't have to fight or flee or freeze? What if instead you breathed, not as a cliche, not as a self-help trick, but as a sacred act of self-rescue? In Buddhist teaching, emotions are not enemies. They are energies, movements of mind, conditions that arise and pass, like clouds across a vast sky. The problem is never the emotion itself, but our relationship to it. We fear it, We resist it, we attach to it, we identify with it. We say, I am angry instead of. Anger is arising. But here's the truth the Buddha saw so clearly. What arises also passes. If you don't cling, if you don't push, if you simply stay, and this is where the breath returns. Not to stop the emotion, but to hold you through it. When the waves of anger rise, the breath is your anchor. When grief pours through your chest, the breath is your ground. When anxiety wraps around your ribcage, the breath becomes the one place still open, still alive, still safe. Have you ever noticed this? When you're furious, your breath becomes fast and sharp. When you're anxious, it becomes shallow and erratic. When you're sad, it sighs, the breath doesn't lie. It speaks the truth your words often can't. But here's the miracle. It not only mirrors your emotions, it can change them. When you change your breath, you change your nervous system. When you soften your breath, your mind begins to soften too. There's a simple practice taught in many Buddhist lineages. It's called breathing with the emotion. Not avoiding, not fixing, not analyzing, just sitting, breathing, and saying silently, hello anger, I see you. Hello fear, you're welcome here. It sounds strange, but it's revolutionary. Because in that moment, you're not reacting, you're witnessing, you're holding space for the storm to rise and pass. There's a story of a monk who once said, when anger visits, I invite it to tea. It's not a battle, it's a meeting. And the breath is how we stay in the room, because most people don't realize emotions only last 90 seconds. Unless we feed them with thought, that's what the mind does. It loops, it builds stories, it adds fuel to the fire. But the breath, it cools the flame. It doesn't argue, it doesn't judge. It just brings you back to this moment, this body, this breath, and in doing so, it takes away the oxygen from the emotion's fire. Try this now if you're able. Think of something that triggers you, not to suffer, just to observe. Feel what it does to your chest, your jaw, your breath. Now breathe in slowly. Count to 4, hold it gently, exhale to 6, slowly, fully. Feel that. That's not just calm. That's power returning. Not the power to control the world, but the power to remain free within it. This is why breath is central to all meditation, not because it's spiritual decoration, but because it's the first and last place you meet yourself fully. And when emotions rise, the breath is not separate, it's with you, whispering, stay, don't run, let's breathe through this together. So Tame, there's a longing inside you. Maybe you don't speak of it out loud. Maybe you're not even aware of it most days, but it's there, like a low hum beneath the noise of life, a quiet ache that whispers, I want to go home. Not to a house, not to a person, not to a past, but to something real, something deep, something that feels like you. Before the world told you who to be, we spend so much of our lives moving away from ourselves. We chase goals, status, approval. We live in performance. We smile when we're breaking. We nod when we want to scream. And somewhere along the way, we forget. We forget how it feels to just be, to exist without proving, pleasing, or pretending, to sit in stillness and know, this is me, and I am enough. But there is a way back, not through effort, not through becoming someone better, but through something much simpler. The breath, every inhale, brings you inward. Every exhale softens the mask. It's not just oxygen, it's a reminder you are here, you are alive, you are home. In Buddhism, this home has many names. The original face before your parents were born, the unborn, unconditioned, deathless nature, the true self that is not a self at all, but you don't need a name, you can feel it. In the stillness between thoughts, in the quiet presence beneath emotion, in the gentle rhythm of the breath that asks for nothing and gives everything. Close your eyes for a moment. Let the world drop away. Feel your breath as it rises, Cool at the tip of your nose, feel it fall. Soft and warm at the back of your throat. Nothing to fix, nothing to figure out, just this moment. Just this breath, and in this breath, can you sense something familiar? A space that doesn't judge you, a silence that welcomes everything, a stillness that says, you don't need to run anymore, you were never lost. This is not escape. It's not denial of pain or chaos, it's a return to the part of you that was never touched by the storm, to the witness, the awareness, the unshaken center. Modern life trains us to look outward, scroll more, achieve more, own more, be more. But the spiritual path has always been about less distraction, less ego, less noise, until eventually there's nothing left to peel away. And what's left? Just breath, just presence, just you. Thich Nhat Hanh once said, breathing in, I dwell in the present moment. Breathing out, I know this is a wonderful moment. It's simple, but don't confuse that with easy. Because to truly return to yourself, you have to stop running. And in the silence, you may meet pain, you may meet memories, you may meet parts of yourself long exiled, but stay with the breath. Let it hold you like a parent holds a frightened child. Let it rock you gently through the waves. And you will see, you are not broken, you are not your thoughts, you are not your past. You are the sky that holds the weather. You are the ocean beneath the waves. You are the breath that never left you. In time, the masks begin to fall. Not because you force them off, but because they simply no longer fit. You find yourself speaking more honestly, listening more deeply, loving without needing. Because once you've touched the home within, you stop looking for it outside. And here's the miracle, this home, it's portable. You can carry it into traffic, into conflict, into grief, into joy. All it takes is one conscious breath. And you're back to the ground beneath your feet, back to the still point in your chest, back to the place where nothing is missing. So the next time you feel far from yourself, don't reach for distraction, don't try to fix. Just pause, breathe, listen, and remember you don't need to search for home, you are already there. You always were, you just forego. Have you ever watched a monk breathe? Not during a guided meditation, not as a performance, but quietly in a moment where no one's watching. It's different. There's no strain, no effort, no searching, just breath, effortless, smooth, grounded. As if the entire universe were inhaling through them and exhaling through them. They're not doing the breath, they're being the breath. To the outside eye, it looks simple, boring, even. But what you're seeing is the result of a lifelong journey. A transformation that doesn't begin in the lungs, but in the mind. The secret of the masters is not a technique. It's not a trick passed down in dusty scrolls. It's something far more subtle. They have changed their relationship with reality. You see, most of us breathe in survival mode. Our breath reflects our inner chaos, shallow when anxious, held when scared, scattered when overwhelmed. The breath becomes a mirror of the storm within. But for the masters, the breath doesn't echo the mind. It tames it, like a shepherd with a wild horse. The breath leads the mind gently back to stillness. In Buddhist monasteries, novice monks are trained in anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, but it's not just watching the breath. It's entering into it, becoming so intimate with each inhale and exhale that the boundary between me and breathing dissolves. They breathe as if nothing else exists, because in that moment, nothing else does. It might seem like withdrawal, but it's the opposite. It's pure presence, complete attunement to the now. While the world chases 1,000 desires, the master returns to this one moment, this one breath, again and again. There's a Zen story that speaks to this. A student asked the master, "What is enlightenment?" The master replied, "When hungry, eat, when tired, sleep." The student was confused, but we all do that. The master smiled, "No, When you eat, you think of 1,000 things. When you sleep, you dream of 1,000 regrets. When I eat, I eat. When I sleep, I sleep. And when they breathe, they breathe. This is the monk's secret. Not in escaping the world, but in fully arriving in it. Neuroscience has caught up, of course. We now know that slow, deep, conscious breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, calming stress, balancing hormones, improving focus. But the monks knew long before the science. They learned through silence, through patience, through a willingness to sit with themselves, until the noise wore itself out. And here's what's most beautiful. You don't need to live in a temple to breathe like a monk. You don't need robes or chants or incense. What you need is presence. When you're washing dishes, breathe. When you're driving, breathe. When you're listening to someone speak, breathe. Let the breath become a sanctuary you carry everywhere. The breath is not just something that happens, it's something you can meet. And every time you meet it fully, you meet a deeper version of yourself. You meet the part of you that doesn't strive, that doesn't cling, that doesn't fear. You meet the stillness beneath the story. In the end, the monk's secret isn't in their breath, it's in their being. They have returned to what the Buddha called the island within yourself, the safe refuge. And the gate to that island, it's not hidden, it's right here. Inhale, exhale, you've already begun. Another day begins. You wake up not from rest, but from exhaustion, phone in hand, eyes half open, a dozen notifications, 3 deadlines, 1 meeting in 15 minutes. And just like that, your body's here, but your mind sprinting ahead, breathing, it's happening, sure. But are you actually there for it? In our modern world, being busy isn't just a lifestyle, it's a badge of honor. A sign that we're productive, needed, important, but deep down we know something's wrong. We move fast but feel lost. We talk constantly but feel unheard. We scroll endlessly but feel empty. We've built cities that never sleep, and minds that never rest. So here's a radical thought. What if breathing, something so ancient, so simple, is the antidote to the chaos of modern life? Long before smartphones, before deadlines, before even written language, human beings knew the breath was sacred. From ancient yogis in the Himalayas, to forest monks in Southeast Asia, to Native American elders who spoke of the wind within the body, all pointed to the same truth. The breath isn't just air, it's awareness. And here's what's profound. You don't have to quit your job. You don't have to escape to a mountain. You don't have to wait for a perfect day. You can practice in the chaos because the breath is portable. It's with you everywhere. Try this. Next time you're in traffic, instead of reaching for your phone, reach for your breath, feel it, let it anchor you, not pull you. Let it remind you you're alive, you're here. And this moment, no matter how messy, is enough. In a busy office, on a crowded subway, at a loud dinner table, there is always a pocket of silence, waiting to be found. Inside you, all you have to do is breathe, with your whole presence. Not shallow, nervous breathing, but deep, intentional, grounding breaths. You see, the ancient masters didn't just sit on cushions all day. They walked, chopped wood, cooked, tended gardens, faced storms inside and out. And through it all, they breathed mindfully. Because mindfulness isn't just something you do in stillness. It's how you carry stillness into movement. There's a Zen saying, the quieter you become, the more you can hear. But in today's world, we don't need more silence outside. We need stillness within, amid the noise. Let's be honest, you'll forget, you'll get pulled in. Emails, family, deadlines, bills, drama, you'll breathe shallowly, you'll clench your jaw. You'll drift, and that's okay, because the breath is endlessly forgiving. It doesn't scold, it doesn't judge, it just comes back. Every time you remember, you begin again. Here's a simple practice when walking. Count 4 steps as you breathe in. Count 4 steps as you breathe out. Inhale 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale 1, 2, 3, 4. Feel your feet touch the ground. Feel your breath touch your life. Or this, set a mindful breath reminder every hour. When it dings, stop for 10 seconds, just 10. Inhale fully, exhale slowly. It may sound trivial, but that 10 seconds could save your day from being lived on autopilot. Even one breath, lived with full attention, is a revolution in this distracted world. It says, I refuse to live asleep. I choose to be here. So yes, the world is fast. Yes, your to-do list is long. Yes, life demands your attention. But within that whirlwind, there is a breath, always waiting for you to notice it. Ancient, simple, eternal. The breath doesn't ask you to escape modern life. It teaches you how to return to it. Fully awake, and that is what the masters have always known. There's something else the breath teaches us, something we rarely speak of, yet deeply feel when the chaos slows. A sense that through all this doing and striving, what we've truly been searching for was not out tea. Imagine this: a monk walks slowly in a forest, no rush, no destination, each step anchored in presence, each breath unhurried, whole. There is no future to chase, no past to regret, only this moment, only this breath, only this step. You don't have to be in a monastery to live this way, because mindfulness isn't found in a faraway land. It's here, in your feet, your breath, your everyday life. We often think meditation means sitting cross-legged for hours, eyes closed, shutting out the world. But real mindfulness doesn't retreat from life. It walks right into it, wide awake. That's why in Zen, we don't just talk about sitting meditation. We speak of walking meditation, eating meditation, even washing the dishes meditation. Because every act, no matter how small, can become a sacred ritual, if done with full awareness. Let's begin with something simple. Walking, most of us walk like we're being chased, head tilted forward, eyes on our phones, mind on something else. But what if you walked, as if each step kissed the earth? What if you walked, like the earth was sacred beneath your feet, and you had nowhere to be? But here, try this. As you take a step, breathe in, I have arrived. As you take the next, breathe out, I am home. Arrived not at a place, but in the present moment. Home, not in a building, but in your own being. Now picture yourself sitting, not scrolling, not fidgeting, just sitting. Can you be fully there? Feel the rhythm of your breath. Notice the sensations in your hands, the rise and fall of your belly, the softness around your eyes. No need to change anything. No need to force stillness. Because mindfulness isn't control. It's attention without resistance. The Buddha once said, when walking, just walk. When sitting, just sit. But above all, don't wobble. It sounds simple, but how often do we truly just do one thing? We eat while checking emails. We drive while replaying arguments. We listen while thinking about what to say next. The body is here, but the mind is everywhere else. And that is suffering, not dramatic suffering, not the kind that screams, but the quiet ache of being pulled in 10 directions and never feeling whole. But with mindful breathing, you re-enter your body, you reclaim your moment. You return to now, even in the most mundane moments. Waiting in line, washing your hands, tying your shoes. You can breathe, you can arrive, and suddenly, life becomes meditation, not separated from the world, but infused into the fabric of your world. You begin to notice the way light filters through the window, the sound of your child's laugh, the warmth of a cup in your hand, the coolness of air on your skin. You start living, not in your thoughts, but in your senses, not in your stories, but in your experience. And then something shifts. You're no longer waiting for life to happen. You're in it, you're with it, you're part of it. The mind slows, the breath deepens, the heart softens, and that constant craving for something else begins to fade. This is the gift of full awareness. You don't have to chase peace. You just have to stop running from presence. There's a story of a student who asked his Zen master, "Master, what is enlightenment?" The master replied, "When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep." The student was confused. "But everyone eats and sleeps." The master smiled. "Yes, but not everyone truly eats. And not everyone fully sleeps. It's not the what that matters. It's the how, to breathe with presence, to walk without rushing, to sit with awareness, to live awake. That's where transformation begins. And here's the secret. You don't have to be perfect. You'll forget. You'll get distracted. You'll fall into autopilot again. But each breath is an invitation to return. No. At the very end of life, all that remains is the breath, not our name, not our achievements, not our fears or regrets, just one final breath. And then silence. We rarely think about it. We brush it aside. We assume we have time. But each breath we take is not a promise. It's a gift. Each inhale is borrowed. Each exhale returned. The Buddha once asked his disciples, "How long is the human life?" One replied, "Maybe 100 years." Another guessed, "Perhaps the time it takes to eat a meal." But the Buddha shook his head and said, "The length of life is just one breath." That teaching is not meant to scare us. It's meant to wake us up, to remind us life is happening now. Not tomorrow, not next year, not when things are perfect, but here, right here. We chase, we plan, we strive. As if we were immortal, we postpone joy, we delay peace. We tell ourselves, "I'll rest once I finish this. I'll breathe once things calm down." But what if that later never comes? There's a story of a man running from a tiger. He reaches a cliff, grabs a vine, hangs between the tiger above and the abyss below. Then he notices a single wild strawberry growing beside him. He reaches for it, eats it, and smiles. This is the art of being fully alive, even when death is near, even when chaos surrounds us, even when we don't know what comes next. We still taste the strawberry, we still breathe deeply, we still choose presence, because presence isn't denial, it's courage. It's looking life in the face, with eyes open, with heart open, with breath steady, and saying, "I am here, I am awake, I am not missing this moment." So what would change if you truly lived as if this breath might be your last? Would you speak more kindly? Would you hold your loved ones closer? Would you stop waiting to be happy and just let yourself be? This doesn't mean living in fear. It means living in truth. Because when you embrace impermanence, you begin to cherish what is real, not the possessions, not the titles, but the simple, sacred things, the smile from a stranger, the warmth of the sun, the rhythm of your breath, rising and falling, like the ocean, carrying you gently through the great mystery of life. And so we return to where we began, the breath, this soft, unshakable thread that has carried you from your first moment to this very one. You don't need to change your life. You just need to be in your life, to show up, to listen, to soften, to walk not faster, but deeper, to breathe not more, but wiser. Let every breath be a prayer. Let every step be a homecoming. Let every moment be enough, because in the end, what else is there? So if you're still breathing, you're still alive. You still have time to love, to forgive, to awaken, to begin again, one breath at a time. And if this journey through breath, awareness, and presence has touched something in you, some quiet truth you've always known but maybe forgotten, then let's keep walking this path together. If this resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, we don't chase followers. We cultivate stillness. We don't push content. We offer space to breathe. Each video is a small temple. Each word a bell to wake you gently. And every breath an invitation to return home. So, if you feel called, join us not just to watch, but to remember. Thank you for being here, for breathing, for being alive. Until the next breath.